Mysteries of Udolpho by Ann Radcliffe. Volume 2, Chapter 10. Reading and musical selections performed by Kara Dahl Russell. Quote, "And shall no lay of death with pleasing murmur soothe her parted soul? Shall no tear wet her grave?" End quote. Sayers. On the following morning, Emily went early to the apartment of Madame Montoni, who had slept well, and was much recovered. Her spirits had also returned with her health, and her resolution to oppose Montoni's demands revived, though it yet struggled with her fears, which Emily, who trembled for the consequence of further opposition, endeavoured to confirm. Her aunt, which has already been shown, had a disposition which delighted in contradiction, and which taught her, when unpleasant circumstances were offered to her understanding, not to inquire into their truth, but to seek for arguments, by which she might make them appear false. Long habit had so entirely confirmed this natural propensity that she was not conscious of possessing it. Emily's remonstrances and representations, therefore, roused her pride instead of alarming or convincing her judgment, and she still relied on the discovery of some means by which she might yet avoid submitting to the demand of her husband. Considering that, if she could once escape from the castle, she might defy his power, and, obtaining a decisive separation, live in comfort on the estates that yet remained for her, she mentioned this to her niece, who accorded with her in the wish, but differed from her as to the probability of its completion. She represented the impossibility of passing the gates, secured and guarded as they were, and the extreme danger of committing her design to the discretion of a servant, who might either purposely betray or accidentally disclose it. Montoni's vengeance would also disdain restraint if her intention was detected, and, though Emily wished, as fervently as she could do, to regain her freedom and return to France, she consulted only Madame Montoni's safety, and persevered in advising her to relinquish her settlement, without braving further outrage. The struggle of contrary emotions, however, continued to rage in her aunt's bosom, and she still brooded over the chance of effecting an escape. While she thus sat, Montoni entered the room, and, without noticing his wife's indisposition, said that he came to remind her of the impolicy of trifling with him, and that he gave her only till evening to determine whether she would consent to his demand, or compel him, by a refusal, to remove her to the east turret. He added that a party of cavaliers would dine with him that day, and that he expected that she would sit at the head of the table, where Emily also must be present. Madame Montoni was now on the point of uttering an absolute refusal, but, suddenly considering that her liberty during this entertainment, though circumscribed, might favour her further plans, she acquiesced, with seeming reluctance, and Montoni soon after left the apartment. His command struck Emily with surprise and apprehension, who shrank from the thought of being exposed to the gaze of strangers, such as her fancy represented these to be, and the words of Count Morano, now again recollected, did not soothe her fears. When she withdrew to prepare for dinner, she dressed herself with even more simplicity than usual, that she might escape observation, a policy which did not avail her, for as she repassed to her aunt's apartment she was met by Montoni, who censured what he called her prudish appearance, and insisted that she should wear the most splendid dress she had, even that which had been prepared for her intended nuptials with Count Morano, and which, it now appeared, her aunt had carefully brought with her from Venice. This was made not in the Venetian but in the Neapolitan fashion, so as to set off the shape and figure to the utmost advantage. In it her beautiful chestnut tresses were negligently bound up in pearls, and suffered to fall back again on her neck. The simplicity of a better taste than Madame Montoni's was conspicuous in this dress, splendid as it was, and Emily's unaffected beauty never had appeared more captivatingly. She had now only to hope that Montoni's order was prompted not by any extraordinary design, but by an ostentation of displaying his family richly attired to the eyes of strangers. Yet nothing less than his absolute command could have prevailed with her to wear a dress that had been designed for such an offensive purpose, much less to have worn it on this occasion. As she descended to dinner, the emotion of her mind threw a faint blush over her countenance, and heightened its interesting expression. For timidity had made her linger in her apartment till the utmost moment, and, when she entered the hall, in which a kind of state dinner was spread, Montoni and his guests were already seated at the table. She was then going to place herself by her aunt, but Montoni waved his hand, and two of the cavaliers rose and seated her between them. The eldest of these was a tall man with strong Italian features, an aquiline nose, and dark penetrating eyes that flashed with fire when his mind was agitated, and, even in its state of rest, retained somewhat of the wildness of the passions. His visage was long and narrow, and his complexion a sickly yellow. The other, who appeared to be about 40, had features of a different cast, yet Italian, and his look was slow, subtle, and penetrating. His eyes, of a dark gray, were small and hollow. His complexion was a sunburnt brown, and the contour of his face, though inclined to oval, was irregular and ill-formed. 8 other guests sat around the table, who were all dressed in a uniform, and had all an expression more or less of wild fierceness, of subtle design, or of licentious passions. As Emily timidly surveyed them, she remembered the scene of the preceding morning, and again almost fancied herself surrounded by banditti. Then, looking back to the tranquillity of her early life, she felt scarcely less astonishment than grief at her present situation. The scene in which they sat assisted the illusion. It was an ancient hall, gloomy in the style of its architecture, from its great extent, and because almost the only light it received was from one large Gothic window, and from a pair of folding doors which, being open, admitted likewise a view of the west rampart, with the wild mountains of the Apennine beyond. The middle compartment of this hall rose into a vaulted roof, enriched with fretwork, and supported on 3 sides by pillars of marble. Beyond these, long colonnades retired in gloomy grandeur, till their extent was lost in twilight. The lightest footsteps of the servants, as they advanced through these, were returned in whispering echoes, and their figures, seen at a distance imperfectly through the dusk, frequently awakened Emily's imagination. She looked alternately at Montoni, at his guests, and on the surrounding scene, and then, remembering her dear native province, her pleasant home, and the simplicity and goodness of the friends whom she had lost, grief and surprise again occupied her mind. When her thoughts could return from these considerations, She fancied she observed an air of authority towards his guests, such as she had never before seen him assume, though he had always been distinguished by a haughty carriage. There was something also in the manners of the strangers that seemed perfectly, though not servilely, to acknowledge his superiority. During dinner the conversation was chiefly on war and politics. They talked with energy of the state of Rome, its dangers, the character of the reigning doge and of the chief senators, and then spoke of the state of Rome. When the repast was over they rose, and, each filling his goblet with wine from the gilded ewer that stood beside him, drank "Success to our exploits!" Montoni was lifting his goblet to his lips to drink this toast, when suddenly the wine hissed, rose to the brim, and, as he held the glass from him, it burst into 1,000 pieces. To him, who constantly used that sort of Venice glass which had the quality of breaking, upon receiving a poisoned liquor, a suspicion that some of his guests had endeavored to betray him instantly occurred, and he ordered all the gates to be closed, drew his sword, and, looking round on them who stood in silent amazement, exclaimed, "Here is a traitor among us. Let those that are innocent assist in discovering the guilty." Indignation flashed from the eyes of the cavaliers, who all drew their swords, and Madame Montoni, terrified at what might ensue, was hastening from the hall, when her husband commanded her to stay. But his further words could not now be distinguished, for the voice of every person rose together. His order that all the servants should appear was at length obeyed, and they declared their ignorance of any deceit, a protestation which could not be believed, for it was evident that, as Montoni's liquor and his only had been poisoned, a deliberate design had been formed against his life, which could not have been carried so far towards its accomplishment without the connivance of the servant who had the care of the wine-ewers. This man, with another, whose face betrayed either the conscience of guilt or the fear of punishment, Montoni ordered to be chained instantly, and confined in a strong room which had formerly been used as a prison. Thither likewise he would have sent all his guests, had he not foreseen the consequence of so bold and unjustifiable a proceeding. As to those, therefore, he contented himself with swearing that no man should pass the gates till this extraordinary affair had been investigated, and then sternly bade his wife to retire to her apartment, whither he suffered Emily to attend her. In about half an hour he followed to the dressing-room, and Emily observed with horror his dark countenance and quivering lip, and heard him denounce vengeance on her aunt. "It will avail you nothing," he said to his wife, "to deny the fact. I have proof of your guilt. Your only chance of mercy rests on a full confession. There is nothing to hope from the sullenness or falsehood. Your accomplice has confessed all." Emily's fainting spirits were roused by astonishment, as she heard her aunt accused of a crime so atrocious, and she could not for a moment admit the possibility of her guilt. Meanwhile Madame Montoni's agitation did not permit her to reply. Alternately her complexion varied from livid paleness to crimson flush, and she trembled, but whether with fear or with indignation, it were difficult to decide. "Spare your words," said Montoni, seeing her about to speak. "Your countenance makes full confession of your crime. You shall be instantly removed to the east turret." "This accusation," said Madame Montoni, speaking with difficulty, "is used only as an excuse for your cruelty. I disdain to reply to it. "You do not believe me guilty." "Signor," said Emily solemnly, "this dreadful charge, I would answer with my life, is false. Nay, signor," she added, observing the severity of his countenance, "this is no moment for restraint on my part. I do not scruple to tell you that you are deceived, most wickedly deceived, by the suggestion of some person who aims at the ruin of my aunt. It is impossible that you could yourself have imagined a crime so hideous." Montoni, his lips trembling more than before, replied only, "If you value your own safety," addressing Emily, "you will be silent. I shall know how to interpret your remonstrances, should you persevere in them." Emily raised her eyes calmly to heaven. "Here is indeed, then, nothing to hope," said she. "Peace!" cried Montoni, "or you shall find there is something to fear." He turned to his wife, who had now recovered her spirits, and who vehemently and wildly remonstrated upon this mysterious suspicion. But Montoni's rage heightened with her indignation, and Emily, dreading the event of it, threw herself between them, and clasped his knees in silence, looking up in his face with an expression that might have softened the heart of a fiend. Whether his was hardened by a conviction of Madame Montoni's guilt, or that a bare suspicion of it made him eager to exercise vengeance, he was totally and alike insensible to the distress of his wife, and to the pleading looks of Emily, whom he made no attempt to raise, but was vehemently menacing both, when he was called out of the room by some person at the door. As he shut the door, Emily heard him turn the lock and take out the key, so that Madame Montoni and herself were now prisoners, and she saw that his designs became more and more terrible. Her endeavours to explain his motives for this circumstance were almost as ineffectual as those to soothe the distress of her aunt, whose innocence she could not doubt, but she at length accounted for Montoni's readiness to suspect his wife by his own consciousness of cruelty towards her, and for the sudden violence of his present conduct against both. Before even his suspicions could be completely formed, by his general eagerness to effect suddenly whatever he was led to desire, and his carelessness of justice or humanity in accomplishing it. Madame Montoni, after some time, again looked around, in search of a possibility of escape from the castle, and conversed with Emily on the subject, who was now willing to encounter any hazard, though she forbore to encourage a hope in her aunt, which she herself did not admit. How strongly the edifice was secured, and how vigilantly guarded, she knew too well, and trembled to commit their safety to the caprice of the servant whose assistance they must solicit. Old Carlo was compassionate, but he seemed to be too much in his master's interest to be trusted by them. Annette could of herself do little, and Emily knew Ludovico only from her report. At present, however, these considerations were useless, Madame Montoni and her niece being shut up from all intercourse, even with the persons whom there might be these reasons to reject. In the hall, confusion and tumult still reigned. Emily, as she listened anxiously to the murmur that sounded along the gallery, sometimes fancied she heard the clashing of swords, and, when she considered the nature of the provocation given by Montoni and his impetuosity, it appeared probable that nothing less than arms would terminate the contention. Madame Montoni, having exhausted all her expressions of indignation, and Emily hers of comfort, they remained silent, in that kind of breathless stillness which, in nature, often succeeds to the uproar of conflicting elements, a stillness like the morning that dawns upon the ruins of an earthquake. An uncertain kind of terror pervaded Emily's mind. The circumstances of the past hour still came dimly and confusedly to her memory, and her thoughts were various and rapid, though without tumult. From this state of waking visions she was recalled by a knocking at the chamber door, and inquiring who was there, heard the whispering voice of Annette.
"Dear madam, let me come in. I have a great deal to say," said the poor girl.
"The door is locked," answered the lady.
"Yes, ma'am, but pray do open it."
"The signor has the key," said Madame Montoni.
"Oh, blessed Virgin, what will become of us?" exclaimed Annette.
"Assist us to escape," said her mistress. "Where is Ludovico?"
"Below in the hall, ma'am, amongst them all, fighting with the best of them."
"Fighting? Who are fighting?" cried Madame Montoni.
"Why, the signor, ma'am, and all the signors, and a great many more."
"Is any person hurt?" said Emily in a tremulous voice.
"Hurt? Yes, mademoiselle. They lie there bleeding, and the swords are clashing, and, oh, holy saints, do let me in, ma'am. They are coming this way. I shall be murdered."
"Fly!" cried Emily. "Fly! We cannot open the door." Annette repeated that they were coming, and in the same moment fled. "Be calm, madam," said Emily, turning to her aunt. "I entreat you to be calm. I am not frightened in the least. Do not you be alarmed." "You can scarcely support yourself," replied her aunt. "Merciful God, what is it they mean to do with us?" "They come, perhaps, to liberate us," said Emily. "Signor Montoni, perhaps, is conquered." The belief of his death gave her spirits a sudden shock, and she grew faint as she saw him in imagination expiring at her feet.
"Oh, they are coming!" cried Madame Montoni. "I hear their steps. Oh, they are at the door."
Emily turned her languid eyes to the door, but terror deprived her of utterance. The key sounded in the lock. The door opened, and Montoni appeared, followed by 3 ruffian-like men. "Execute your orders," said he, turning to them and pointing to his wife, who shrieked, but was immediately carried from the room, while Emily sunk senseless on a couch by which she had endeavored to support herself. When she recovered, she was alone, and recollected only that Madame Montoni had been there, together with some unconnected particulars of the preceding transaction, which were, however, significant to renew all her terror. She looked wildly around the apartment, as if in search of some means of intelligence concerning her aunt, while neither her own danger nor an idea of escaping from the room immediately occurred. When her recollection was more complete, she raised herself and went, but with only a faint hope, to examine whether the door was unfastened. It was so, and she then stepped timidly out into the gallery, but paused there, uncertain which way she should proceed. Her first wish was to gather some information as to her aunt, and she at length turned her steps to go to the lesser hall, where Annette and the other servants usually waited. Everywhere, as she passed, she heard from a distance the uproar of contention, and the figures and faces which she met hurrying along the passages struck her mind with dismay. Emily might now have appeared like an angel of light encompassed by fiends. At length she reached the lesser hall, which was silent and deserted, but, panting for breath, she sat down to recover herself. The total stillness of this place was as awful as the tumult from which she had escaped. But she had now time to recall her scattered thoughts, to remember her personal danger, and to consider of some means of safety. She perceived that it was useless to seek Madame Montoni through the wide extent and intricacies of the castle, now too when every avenue seemed to be beset by ruffians. In this hall she could not resolve to stay, for she knew not how soon it might become their place of rendezvous, and, though she wished to go to her chamber, she dreaded again to encounter them on the way. Thus she sat, trembling and hesitating, when a distant murmur broke on the silence and grew louder and louder till she distinguished voices and steps approaching. She then rose to go, but the sounds came along the only passage by which she could depart, and she was compelled to await in the hall the arrival of the persons whose steps she heard. As these advanced, she distinguished groans, and then saw a man borne slowly along by 4 others. Her spirits faltered at the sight, and she leaned against the wall for support. The bearers meanwhile entered the hall, and being too busily occupied to detain or even notice Emily, she attempted to leave it, but her strength failed, and again she sat down on the bench. A damp chilliness came over her. Her sight became confused. She knew not what had passed or where she was, yet the groans of the wounded person still vibrated on her heart. In a few moments the tide of life seemed again to flow. She began to breathe more freely, and her senses revived. She had not fainted, nor had ever totally lost her consciousness, but had contrived to support herself on the bench, still without courage to turn her eyes upon the unfortunate object which remained near her, and about whom the men were yet too much engaged to attend to her. When her strength returned, she rose, and was suffered to leave the hall, though her anxiety, having produced some vain enquiries concerning Madame Montoni, had thus made a discovery of herself. Towards her chamber she now hastened, as fast as her steps would bear her, for she still perceived upon her passage the sounds of confusion at a distance, and she endeavoured, by taking her way through some obscure rooms, to avoid encountering the persons whose looks had terrified her before, as well as those parts of the castle where the tumult might still rage. At length she reached her chamber, and, having secured the door of the corridor, felt herself for a moment in safety. A profound stillness reigned in this remote apartment, which not even the faint murmur of the most distant sounds now reached. She sat down near one of the casements, and, as she gazed on the mountain view beyond, the deep repose of its beauty struck her with all the force of contrast, and she could scarcely believe herself so near a scene of savage discord. The contending elements seemed to have retired from their natural spheres, and to have collected themselves into the minds of men, for there alone the tempest now reigned. Emily tried to tranquilize her spirits, but anxiety made her constantly listen for some sound, and often look out upon the ramparts, where all, however, was lonely and still. As a sense of her own immediate danger had decreased, her apprehension concerning Madame Montoni heightened, who, she remembered, had been fiercely threatened with confinement in the east turret, and it was possible that her husband had satisfied his present vengeance with this punishment. She therefore determined, when night should return and the inhabitants of the castle should be asleep, to explore the way to the turret, which, as the direction it stood in was mentioned, appeared not very difficult to be done. She knew, indeed, that although her aunt might be there, she could afford her no effectual assistance, but it might give her some comfort even to know that she was discovered, and to hear the sound of her niece's voice. For herself, any certainty concerning Madame Montoni's fate appeared more tolerable than this exhausting suspense. Meanwhile, Annette did not appear, and Emily was surprised and somewhat alarmed for her, whom, in the confusion of the late scene, various accidents might have befallen, and it was improbable that she would have failed to come to her apartment unless something unfortunate had happened. Thus the hours passed in solitude, in silence, and in anxious conjecturing. Being not once disturbed by a message or a sound, it appeared that Montoni had wholly forgotten her, and it gave her some comfort to find that she could be so unnoticed. She endeavored to withdraw her thoughts from the anxiety that preyed upon them, but they refused control. She could neither read nor draw, and the tones of her lute were so utterly discordant with the present state of her feelings that she could not endure them for a moment. The sun at length set behind the western mountains. His fiery beams faded from the clouds, and then a dun melancholy purple drew over them, and gradually involved the features of the country below. Soon after, the sentinels passed on the rampart to commence the watch. Twilight had now spread its gloom over every object. The dismal obscurity of her chamber recalled fearful thoughts, but she remembered that to procure a light she must pass through a great extent of the castle, and, above all, through the halls, where she had already experienced so much horror. Darkness, indeed, in the present state of her spirits, made silence and solitude terrible to her. It would also prevent the possibility of her finding her way to the turret, and condemn her to remain in suspense concerning the fate of her aunt. Yet she dared not to venture forth for a lamp. Continuing at the casement, that she might catch the last lingering gleam of evening, a thousand vague images of fear floated on her fancy. What if some of these ruffians, said she, should find out the private staircase, and in the darkness of night steal into my chamber? Then, recollecting the mysterious inhabitant of the neighboring apartment, her terror changed its object. He is not a prisoner, said she, though he remains in one chamber, for Montoni did not fasten the door when he left it. The unknown person himself did this. It is certain, therefore, he can come out when he pleases. She paused, for notwithstanding the terrors of darkness, she considered it to be very improbable, whoever he was, that he could have any interest in intruding upon her retirement. And again the subject of her emotion changed when, remembering her nearness to the chamber where the veil had formerly disclosed a dreadful spectacle, she doubted whether some passage might not communicate between it and the insecure door of the staircase. It was now entirely dark, and she left the casement. As she sat with her eyes fixed on the hearth, she thought she perceived there a spark of light. It twinkled and disappeared, and then again was visible. At length, with much care, she fanned the embers of a wood fire that had been lighted in the morning into flame, and having communicated it to a lamp, which always stood in her room, felt a satisfaction not to be conceived without a review of her situation. Her first care was to guard the door of the staircase, for which purpose she placed against it all the furniture she could move, and she was thus employed for some time, at the end of which she had another instance how much more oppressive misfortune is to the idle than to the busy, for, having then leisure to think over all the circumstances of her present afflictions, she imagined 1,000 evils for futurity, and these real and ideal subjects of distress alike wounded her mind. Thus heavily moved the hours till midnight, when she counted the sullen notes of the great clock, and they rolled along the rampart unmingled with any sound, except for the distant footfall of the sentinel who came to relieve guard. She now thought she might venture towards the turret, and, having gently opened the chamber door to examine the corridor, and to listen if any person was stirring in the castle, found all around in perfect stillness. Yet no sooner had she left the room than she perceived a light flash on the walls of the corridor, and without waiting to see by whom it was carried, she shrunk back and closed her door. No one approaching, she conjectured that it was Montoni going to pay his midnight visit to her unknown neighbour, and she determined to wait till he should have retired to his own apartment. When the chimes had tolled another half-hour, she once more opened the door, and perceiving that no person was in the corridor, hastily crossed into a passage that led along the south side of the castle towards the staircase, whence she believed she could easily find her way to the turret. Often pausing on her way, listening apprehensively to the murmurs of the wind, and looking fearfully onward into the gloom of the long passages, she at length reached the staircase. But there her perplexity began. 2 passages appeared, of which she knew not how to prefer one, and was compelled at last to decide by chance rather than by circumstances. That she entered opened first into a wide gallery, along which she passed lightly and swiftly, for the lonely aspect of the place awed her, and she started at the echo of her own steps. On a sudden she thought she heard a voice, and, not distinguishing from whence it came, feared equally to proceed or to return. For some moments she stood in an attitude of listening expectation, shrinking almost from herself, and scarcely daring to look around her. The voice came again, but, though it was now near her, terror did not allow her to judge exactly whence it proceeded. She thought, however, that it was the voice of complaint, and her belief was soon confirmed by a low moaning sound that seemed to proceed from one of the chambers opening into the gallery. It instantly occurred to her that Madame Montoni might there be confined, and she advanced to the door to speak, but was checked by considering that she was, perhaps, going to commit herself to a stranger who might discover her to Montoni, for, though this person, whoever it was, seemed to be in affliction, it did not follow that he was a prisoner. While these thoughts passed over her mind and left her still in hesitation, the voice spoke again, and calling, "Ludovico!" she then perceived it to be that of Annette, on which, no longer hesitating, she went in joy to answer her. "Ludovico!" cried Annette, sobbing. "Ludovico!" "It is not Ludovico, it is I, Mademoiselle Emily." Annette ceased sobbing, and was silent. "If you can open the door, let me in," said Emily. "Here is no person to hurt you." "Ludovico! Oh, Ludovico!" cried Annette. Emily now lost her patience, and her fear of being overheard increasingly. She was even nearly about to leave the door when she considered that Annette might, possibly, know something of the situation of Madame Montoni, or direct her to the turret. At length she obtained a reply, though little satisfactory to her questions, for Annette knew nothing of Madame Montoni, and only conjured Emily to tell her what has become of Ludovico. Of him she had no information to give, and she again asked who had shut Annette up.
"Ludovico," said the poor girl. "Ludovico shut me up. When I ran away from the dressing-room door today, I went I scarcely knew where for safety, and in this gallery here I met Ludovico, who had hurried me into this chamber and locked me up to keep me out of harm, as he said. But he was in such a hurry himself, he hardly spoke 10 words, but he told me he would come and let me out when all was quiet, and he took away the key with him. Now all these hours are past, and I have neither seen nor heard a word from him. They have murdered him. I know they have."
Emily suddenly remembered the wounded person whom she had seen borne into the servants' hall, and she scarcely doubted that he was Ludovico. But she concealed that circumstance from Annette, and endeavoured to comfort her. Then, impatient to learn something of her aunt, she again inquired the way to the turret.
"Oh, you are not going, mademoiselle," said Annette. "For heaven's sake, do not go and leave me here by myself."
"Nay, Annette, you do not think I can wait in the gallery all night," replied Emily. "Direct me to the turret. In the morning I will endeavour to release you."
"Oh, Honey Mary!" exclaimed Annette. "I am to stay here by myself all night. I shall be frightened out of my senses, and I shall die of hunger. I have nothing to eat since dinner."
Emily could scarcely forbear smiling at the heterogeneous distresses of Annette, though she sincerely pitied them, and said what she could to soothe her. At length she obtained something like a direction to the east turret, and quitted the door, from whence, after many intricacies and perplexities, she reached the steep and winding stairs of the turret, at the foot of which she stopped to rest, and to reanimate her courage with a sense of duty. As she surveyed this dismal place, she perceived a door on the opposite side of the staircase, and, anxious to know whether it would lead her to Madame Montoni, she tried to undraw the bolts which fastened it. A fresher air came to her face as she unclosed the door, which opened upon the east rampart, and the sudden current had nearly extinguished her light, which she now removed to a distance, and again, looking out upon the obscure terrace, she perceived only the faint outline of the walls and of some towers, while above, heavy clouds borne along the wind seemed to mingle with the stars and wrap the night in a thicker darkness. As she gazed, now willing to defer the moment of certainty, from which she expected only confirmation of evil, a distant footstep reminded her that she might be observed by the men on watch, and, hastily closing the door, she took her lamp and passed up the staircase. Trembling came upon her as she ascended through the gloom. To her melancholy fancy this seemed to be a place of death, and the chilling silence that reigned confirmed its character. Her spirits faltered. "Perhaps," said she, "I am come hither only to learn a dreadful truth, or to witness some horrible spectacle. I feel that my senses would not survive such an addition of horror." The image of her aunt, murdered perhaps by the hand of Montoni, rose to her mind. She trembled, gasped for breath, repented that she had dared to venture hither, and checked her steps. But after she had paused a few minutes, the consciousness of her duty returned, and she went on. Still all was silent. At length a track of blood upon a stair caught her eye, and instantly she perceived that the wall and several other steps were stained. She paused, again struggled to support herself, and the lamp almost fell from her trembling hand. Still no sound was heard, no living being seemed to inhabit the turret. 1,000 times she wished herself again in her chamber, dreaded to inquire farther, dreaded to encounter some horrible spectacle, and yet could not resolve, now that she was so near the termination of her efforts, to desist from them. Having again collected courage to proceed, after ascending about half-way up the turret, she came to another door, but here again she stopped in hesitation, listened for sounds within. And then, summoning all her resolution, unclosed it, and entered the chamber which, as her lamp shot its feeble rays through the darkness, seemed to exhibit only dew-stained and deserted walls. As she stood examining it, in fearful expectation of discovering the remains of her unfortunate aunt, she perceived something lying in an obscure corner of the room, and, struck with a horrible conviction, she became, for an instant, motionless, and nearly insensible. Then, with a kind of desperate resolution, she hurried towards the object that excited her terror, when, perceiving the clothes of some person on the floor, she caught hold of them, and found in her grasp the old uniform of a soldier, beneath which appeared a heap of pikes and other arms. Scarcely daring to trust her sight, she continued, for some moments, to gaze on the object of her late alarm, and then left the chamber, so much comforted and occupied by the conviction that her aunt was not there, that she was going to descend the turret without inquiring farther, when, on turning to do so, she observed upon some steps on the second flight an appearance of blood, and remembering that there was yet another chamber to be explored, she again followed the windings of the ascent. Still she ascended, the track of blood glared upon the stairs. It led her to the door of a landing-place that terminated them, but she was unable to follow it farther. Now that she was so near the sought-for certainty, she dreaded to know it even more than before, and had not fortitude sufficient to speak or to attempt opening the door. Having listened in vain for some sound that might confirm or destroy her fears, at length laid her hand on the lock, and finding it fastened, called on Madame Montoni. But only a chilling silence ensued. "She is dead!" she cried. "Murdered! Her blood is on the stairs!" Emily grew very faint, could support herself no longer, and had scarcely presence of mind to set down the lamp and place herself on a step. When her recollection returned, she spoke again at the door, and again attempted to open it, and, having lingered for some time without receiving any answer or hearing a sound, she descended the turret, and, with all the swiftness her feebleness would permit, sought her own apartment. As she turned into the corridor, the door of a chamber opened, from whence Montoni came forth. But Emily, more terrified than ever to behold him, shrunk back into the passage soon enough to escape being noticed, and heard him close the door, which she had perceived was the same she formerly observed. Having here listened to his departing steps, till their faint sound was lost in the distance, she ventured to her own apartment, and, securing it once again, retired to her bed, leaving the lamp burning on the hearth. But sleep was fled from her harassed mind, to which images of horror alone occurred. She endeavored to think it possible that Madame Montoni had not been taken to the turret, but when she recollected the former menaces of her husband, and the terrible spirit of vengeance which he had displayed on a late occasion, when she remembered his general character, the looks of the men who had forced Madame Montoni from her apartment, and the written traces on the stairs of the turret, she could not doubt that her aunt had been carried thither, and could scarcely hope that she had not been carried to be murdered. The grey of morning had long dawned through her casements before Emily closed her eyes in sleep, when wearied nature at length yielded her a respite from suffering. End of Volume 2, Chapter 10. Reading and musical selections performed by Kara Dahl Russell.